Hello, welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is Matt Duss. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. I'm joined by Daveed Gartenstein-Ross, a terrorism and foreign policy analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome, Daveed. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Matt. It's great to join you this morning.
Yeah, thanks for doing it. So we're going to jump right into it. The State of the Union was last night. It was bookended with remarks on foreign policy by the president. Obviously, he feels strongly on that. He did a little, I guess you might call it a bit of an end zone dance on bin Laden, the first State of the Union since Osama bin Laden was killed. So what are your thoughts, Daveed?
I thought it was overall a fairly strong State of the Union address. After hearing the State of the Union address / campaign speech, I'm ready to vote for the Navy SEALs as a third-party candidate in this upcoming election.
I agree. It was pretty heavy on that.
But in terms of foreign policy, there was nothing that was particularly unexpected. I found that part of the speech to be by far the most uninteresting. This was different than most State of the Union speeches in that I actually found a lot of it to be really interesting. I'm not sure if any of the interesting parts were actually good ideas. For example, requiring all high school students to graduate from high school. Not sure if that's a good idea. But it certainly was an interesting aspect of the speech. Likewise, there were several other things that, for me at least, who tends to be a foreign policy guy, were unexpected in the domestic policy realm. And in terms of foreign policy, what we had was essentially, as we said, a large end zone dance about SEAL Team 6, and particularly because now we know that when he congratulated Panetta at the before the speech, it was because the SEALs had pulled off another remarkable success,
Right.
freeing an American hostage who was being held in Somalia. So
Right.
there was that SEAL team end zone dance. But other than that, it was basically what you would expect on foreign policy. There was that the Arab Spring was irreversible. He talked about freedom there. That was not a policy. It was what was expected. Talked about Al-Qaeda, talked about the Pacific, basically a roundup of the kind of things that have been brewing for a while. The one exception where I think there is more interesting things is I would include our energy policy as part of our foreign policy / national security. And there at least, there were a few things that I found interesting, one of which was the fact that biofuels didn't get a mention at all.
I don't know. I think what he said on the Arab Spring, it wasn't hugely surprising or innovative, but I mean, let's look at last year. I mean, it was clear, Tunisia had started. Tahrir Square in Cairo was really in full swing. I don't think we had quite as much of an idea that it would be as big as it has become, but we had some sense, and I don't think he didn't really touch on it at all last year.
Right.
And I think he was criticized for that, and I agree with that. I think we did have a sense that it was significant, perhaps not as significant as we know now. So I think kind of putting down.
Although last year they were still struggling really to define what the administration's position should be.
Right.
This
I
was
agree.
at a time when it wasn't clear that the Arab Spring would end up toppling any of the region's various despots, and you had two U.S. allies, Mubarak
Right.
and Ben Ali.
Right.
So did you throw in with the street against someone who's going to maintain power?
Right.
Or it was a difficult situation, and I think that the criticisms of the administration for basically waffling on the Arab Spring as it emerged are they're fair enough. I mean, it's correct that the administration did waffle. It didn't have a strong position. It basically had one toe in the water until it realized that the protests were actually going to overthrow various rulers. But at the same time, I think most anybody would be hard pressed to do any better if they were in that position.
No, I pretty much agree with that. I mean, but I do think, even though, as I said, it wasn't hugely creative what he said last night, I think it is important to put this marker down to make clear that that's, the administration and Obama himself, they understand the huge implications of what's happening. Yeah. And just to kind of stay on this for a minute, I mean, as over the past year, it's become increasingly apparent in a really depressing way. And I don't want to tie this off, but my feeling is that we are really just going to miss this train. Even in the best of circumstances, the sort of political and economic commitment that would be required for the United States to sort of help shape this, not determine the outcomes by any means, but sort of help to shape in a positive way what is happening in the region is very, very likely not going to happen. And I hope it will happen, but my feeling is it's just not. First of all, because of the economic crisis. Yep. And second of all, I mean, let's compare it to Eastern Europe. I mean, in Eastern Europe, or when the Soviet Union came apart, it was very clear our enemy had lost, and the countries that had been dominated by that enemy now wanted to wear blue jeans and Yankees caps and be basically Americans. Whereas what's happening now in the Middle East is very, very different. Our allies have collapsed, and these, if it wasn't exactly the Muslim Brotherhood in Tahrir, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups are clearly benefiting from what's happened. And in this country, we've spent the last 10 years, I don't know if demonizing is the right word, because clearly there are some very dangerous characters in what we, under the heading of what we might call Islamism, but we haven't had a very detailed or nuanced debate about what this all means. And so Americans are very, very frightened about this, and they're simply not going to support the sort of economic and political engagement that it would require to shape it positively.
Although one clear distinction is it's not the inverse of Eastern Europe, right? In Eastern Europe, our enemy collapsed, and people who were pro-U.S. Ended up taking up the mantle of those regimes. In this case, our allies, although not particularly close allies, collapsed, and they weren't toppled by enemies. Right. We dealt with Mubarak and Ben Ali not because we had any illusions about these guys, not because we loved them, but rather because they're the guys who were in power. Sometimes you deal with people simply because they're in power. Now Gaddafi had been our enemy, so one enemy felled, but it's not as though the enemy was felled by friends, and it's not as though the so-called friends were felled by enemies. Rather, the Arab Spring could go multiple directions. And I agree with you that I think we'll miss the boat on our ability to shape what's going on in that part of the world. But the flip side is I also think that and I agree with you that we haven't had a very strong debate about the various factions, not just about Islamism, but also about the relative strength of liberalism within the Arab world and its potentials for catching on. There's a lot that I think we haven't gamed through. When I look at a lot of what's written about the Arab Spring, not everything, but a lot of it, I see things that are either based on the one hand, fear, or on the other hand, false optimism. The truth is quite messy, and I think certainly in the short and medium term, I think a lot of what we'll see over the next few years is going to be disturbing. One immediate thing that I think is highly problematic is the state of religious minorities during the course of this upheaval within the Arab world. Now, in the longer term, in the medium to long term, I think that we could get something very positive out of this. In terms of having more robust options in the Arab world that end up both filtering people away from extremist violent organizations like Al-Qaeda by providing robust alternatives through, for example, religious parties that are part of the electoral system, and Nada in Tunisia, the Brotherhood in Egypt. I think that's one thing that will exist. And a second thing is just lifting the yoke of oppression that had been there, assuming that we do get transition to something resembling a democracy, could be a positive thing medium to long term. But let's not lose sight of, in the short to medium term, we're going to have to do a lot to safeguard our own interests, given that you could see an explosion, or at least a significant increase, if not an explosion, in violent Islamist groups in places like Libya and Egypt. You already see, for example, the growth of a new Al-Qaeda organization in the Sinai.
Right. I mean, just to go back, I mean, when I agree with your much more kind of nuanced take about what has really happened here. When I say that our enemies have fallen, or our friends have fallen, or our enemies have taken over, I'm talking about a perception among the general American electorate. Yes, it's simplistic, but I think that those are the sort of rough outlines of what and frankly, a lot of people on Capitol Hill seem to believe. I mean, even Rick Santorum has been pretty explicit. We screwed up by not supporting Mubarak against the forces of Islamic radicalism, which are now going to take over the country. But I mean, that's the perception.
I think that supporting Mubarak, by the way, in my view, would have been the wrong move. I mean, I think that there are dangers to Mubarak's fall, definite dangers, and I think that over the course of the next year to year and a half, those dangers are really going to become evident. But if we doubled down behind Mubarak and opposed the will of the Egyptian people, then we would put ourselves much more in the role of that hidden hand that's opposing people's aspiration and supporting, frankly, a dictatorship that's responsible for torture, lack of due process, massive oppression of the people of Egypt.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, what I'm getting at with this is just is that foreign aid is kind of a heavy lift in the best of circumstances.
Yeah.
Convincing Americans. I mean, there's sort of Americans have this completely outsized idea of how much foreign aid we actually provide, and it's very, very small. But in the best of circumstances, it's a hard sell. In a situation like this, I just don't see it really happening. Convincing the American people, especially in economic circumstances like that, especially given what people believe to be true about organizations that are now on the rise in the Middle East, the idea that they could be convinced to contribute billions and billions of dollars to help this process along, I just don't think is likely at all.
I think one of the best critiques of foreign aid is that offered by William F. Buckley, who said, foreign aid takes money from poor people in the U.S. and gives it to rich people in other countries. And that's obviously, as all quips are, somewhat unfair. But I think that one truth that you can get to behind that is that often foreign aid isn't related to our strategic interest. It ends up going to the elites of other countries. It's siphoned off. It doesn't achieve the purposes that it's bound for. Again, not all the time, but this often happens. And I think that particularly in this era of austerity, and we're definitely entering an era of austerity, it has not fully hit yet. But in this era of austerity, I think one thing we need to better do is to link our foreign aid programs and other foreign programs very intimately to national interest. And this is an area in the countries that are newly democratizing. That's an area where we have a national interest. And so I think focusing foreign aid resources on areas like that, that's something where we could have a very positive outcome if we use our foreign aid wisely. So I agree with you, and I support that, particularly within a paradigm that's intensely focused on how do we support U.S. national interest through both U.S. soft power and in some instances, obviously, U.S. hard power.
So before we move from the State of the Union, I just want to stay for a minute on the president's, his comments about Osama bin Laden and his statements about decimating the al-Qaeda leadership. You, of course, have a book that came out a few months ago, Why Al-Qaeda is Winning. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on what he said and kind of the broader fight against al-Qaeda, where it stands right now.
Well, the one thing I should clarify is that that was the working title of the book. The final title of the book was Bin Laden's Legacy. Why we're still losing the war on terror, not why Al-Qaeda.
I'm sorry. I'm still remembering reading The Galley.
Absolutely. Well, no, the Galley came out with Bin Laden's Legacy as the title. You're remembering my Twitter account, which,
yes, okay.
which used that title many times.
Thank you.
I fully agree with the president about the decimation of Al-Qaeda's ranks. The area where I differ with some of the triumphalism out of the administration, triumphalism that's reflected in the State of the Union address, and I think fairly so. I don't begrudge him in celebrating this. But the area where I disagree with some analysts is I think that this reminds me of where we were back in 2003, 2004. You had almost the same proclamations coming out of top levels. Now you've had about 75% of Al-Qaeda's top leaders who've been killed, whereas back in 2003, 2004, you had 75% who were killed or captured. Those were the days back when we would actually capture terrorists as opposed to only killing them. And what we found was that between 2004 and 2006, there was a massive rebound in Al-Qaeda's ability to execute major plots, as represented by the August 2006 arrest of operatives who were going to use liquid explosives to take down 7 planes bound from Britain to the United States.
Yeah.
Michael Chertoff, who was the DHS secretary, said this could have cost thousands of lives and also decimated the airline industry. So, I question whether we now have a better handle on the resilience of networks like that. I agree with the administration's assessments that right now Al-Qaeda would not be able to execute another attack like 9/11, period. But I also wonder whether, in 9 months, a year and a half, 2 years, they'll have regenerated that capacity. And that's where my concern lies. The other part of my book was a strategic critique of where we've been over the course of the past 10 years, basically situating Al-Qaeda's strategy as being fundamentally an economic strategy. In other words, they were fighting a different war than we thought they were fighting. Their goal wasn't simply to carry out a massive terrorist attack. It was to sap the American economy, and I think they've been a lot more effective at that than a lot of people would really like to admit.
Right, like referring to bin Laden's, quote, bleed until bankruptcy strategy.
Right.
Some have suggested that was sort of a post hoc justification, but you don't think that's true.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, you can go back to bin Laden's declaration of war in 1996, and in that speech, he very clearly frames the American economy as being this country's center of gravity, that it's the U.S.'s economic might that is able to drive its military power. In that speech, in addition to declaring war on the U.S., he also strongly advocates people boycotting America in order to undermine its economy. Even before the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden wrote a letter to Mullah Omar explaining that if America did invade when the attacks occurred, that it would get bogged down, its economy would suffer. Now, whether he could have been playing this up to Mullah Omar, trying to make him feel good about the fact that the Taliban was about to be toppled. But we see that he had economics in mind at the time. And one final piece of the puzzle, which I think is very important, a very early data point, is in October of 2001. So about a month after the 9/11 attacks, while American bombs were falling on Afghanistan, bin Laden gave an interview with an Al Jazeera journalist named Taysir Aluni. And in the interview, he talks about what he thought he accomplished with the 9/11 attacks. And the very first thing he turns to is the economic impact of the attacks. And you can tell he'd given a lot of thought to that, saying we took out 60% of the value of the stock market. The stock market trades at $4 trillion. Therefore, we took out no less than $640 billion by the lowest estimates. It goes on factoring in lost productivity, building and construction losses. Basically, he's talking the language of the Wall Street Journal. And that, in October 2001, is the first thing that he turns to. For that reason, I think that later on, when he talked about undermining the American economy, that wasn't coming out of the blue. That was something that he clearly had in mind at the time of 9/11.
So let's turn to the events around the Strait of Hormuz over the past month. Let's see, and it was late December, I think, when it was I don't think it was I think it was an Iranian military commander who, in response to the imminent signing of the latest sanctions coming out of Congress, pretty serious sanctions on companies doing business with the Iran central bank. This Iranian commander made a threat that if you tried to stop the flow of oil or threatened Iran's flow of oil, that Iran would block the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
Obviously, this is very, very serious. Some 20% of the global oil, of the world's oil, moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Closing that strait or making passage difficult could have enormous impact on the global economy. Yet here we are a month later. Over the past few days, we've seen much less belligerence from Iran over this. They have, I think, very seriously walked back, or at least climbed down from some of those threats. And this is, I think, the president and his administration actually handled this fairly well. The president, first of all, went ahead and signed the sanctions and has continued consultations with European partners and others on how to implement them and at what speed. Secretary of Defense Panetta and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dempsey appeared on Meet the Press Face the Nation early in January and discussed this. Both of them saying, if they try to block the straits, we'll respond. Talking about the nuclear issue as well, and of course the USS Abraham Lincoln with its carrier group, accompanied by a French and British ship, entered the Strait, entered the Persian Gulf through the Strait this past weekend without incident.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think the administration deserves credit. I will say that this was something that didn't really concern me throughout from the very outset. I did a few interviews, a few radio interviews right when this occurred, and what I pointed out then, and I maintain now, is that there's nothing that Iran could do to align the world against it. Nothing would succeed more in aligning everyone against it than shutting the Strait of Hormuz. Suddenly, every country would come to life in opening up the Strait again. The studies that have been done of what would happen if Iran were to, say, mine the Strait of Hormuz or otherwise try to close it, all conclude that it would only succeed in closing it for a temporary period. It doesn't have the force to keep it closed. And so for that reason, I thought this was basically saber-rattling on Iran's part. That being said, when saber-rattling occurs, when a bluff occurs, you need to walk it back. You can't. You obviously can't just concede. But also, B, there's always the danger that things could end up escalating rather than getting to the point where they are now, which is a de-escalation. So I think that this is something that, in my opinion, most administrations, most people in charge would be able to successfully navigate it. But that being said, any administration needs to get the relatively easy things right, and certainly I believe that this administration did so in this case.
Right. I mean, in terms of whether the effects of Iran closing the Strait, I agree. I mean, the comparison I keep using was Cleavon Little threatening to shoot himself in Blazing Saddles. Because Iran was effectively threatening itself in doing this, but it could, it's just because it's a serious threat. Whether they would actually do it, I think, is another thing. But yes, I mean, that's the thing with threats. When people respond with more threats or too belligerently, or in this case, I don't want to make too much of the criticisms coming from some of the Republican candidates, but they're running for election, and who knows what they would do actually in office, getting the advice of their military. But it was not confidence building. I mean, and I have to say, even some of the criticism coming from more hawks outside of government, or just regular analysts saying, "Oh, we need to respond with strength. We need to respond with these threats with stating what we'll do." And it's like there's a difference here between belligerence and strength. And I think the way the administration responded by showing strength, by saying, this is what we're going to do, what we've always done. If Iran can try, but they will fail. I think that and continuing to, and importantly, also continuing to make clear, and they took extra steps to do this, which actually really impressed me, was to make clear once again that Iran has a negotiations option on its nuclear program, which is driving this whole thing, which is driving the sanctions, the remaining IAEA questions over Iran's nuclear weapons related programs. Making clear, the U.S. and its partners making clear, you have an off-ramp here. I mean, this is not, that you have options here. And I think that was a very, very important piece of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's subtlety to any relationship. We know that intuitively from our own personal lives. Most relationships that are important to us are, there's a subtlety to a lot of them. If someone does something you don't like, you don't just threaten to not be their friend anymore right away. Likewise, in international diplomacy, you don't immediately escalate. There's a subtle aspect to diplomacy, and this certainly was diplomacy that was executed subtly, where there were both, there were clearly threats of force on the administration's part. There's no question about that. But it was handled, I think, very deftly. When people, are out of office, commenting on foreign policy while they're running, I agree that the critiques of the administration didn't do much to inspire confidence in me. But I think, to me, I'm reminded of Obama back in 2008. Where he ran against the Bush administration pretty much across the board on national security issues, on just about everything. And when you look at the last 2 years of the Bush administration to the first 4 years of the Obama administration, Obama didn't really make great changes. And that being said, a big shift in policy did come on the Bush administration's part between 2006 and 2007/2008. So I'm not saying that Obama is exactly like Bush, but that he looks a lot like the last 2 years of the Bush administration, which I think were very good years with respect to the conduct of foreign policy, although some people might remember that there were a few other things that didn't go quite as well. But I think that part of the reason why he was so sweeping in his critique was because he was in the opposition. When you're in the opposition, you don't actually have to govern. You don't actually have to do anything. You just say, look, the guys who are here are bad. And that's what the Republicans are doing. They're playing that game where Obama is bad. And for the most part, I mean, I think that right now, just following Twitter and other commentary, there is this comment on how presidential Obama looks, and I agree that the president does look presidential, where he was contrasted to the Republican debates. I believe that at the end of the day, Romney is going to be the GOP candidate. Obviously, Newt is the rising challenger right now, and we could see a slugfest, or we could even see Gingrich pull it off. But I'm expecting Romney to be the nominee. If you have an Obama-Romney election, I think both men, at the end of the day, are going to look fairly presidential. And Romney, by far, has, in my view, been the most level-headed of the candidates in terms of having a statement of positions during the course of this electoral campaign that'll be difficult to point to anything and say now that's completely insane. Whereas I think Gingrich is still acting as though he's a Fox News talking head, as opposed to a major candidate candidate for the presidency, saying things like he would overthrow the Castro regime, which is going to be fuel. Like if he were the nominee, it would definitely be fuel in the general election for arguments that he's not level-headed enough to be president.
Right. I mean, that's why I do recognize that when people are campaigning, they say certain things, but I don't. I really would hesitate to make an equivalence here between the sort of wild claims being made by, say, Santorum and Gingrich, and the sort of critique that Obama brought to bear when he was running. I would make a distinction.
I'm not drawing an equivalence. I mean, I'm making a comparison.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I agree that it's not an equivalence. I think that the critiques like the Santorum critiques, for example, are quite a bit heavier than what Obama did during his campaign. But also, I don't. I think that the chance of Santorum being the nominee are basically zero. If you look at the not so much 2008 where you had some experienced people you had some experienced people running at the top of the Democratic ticket, right? You had Obama versus Hillary. Obviously, Obama, calling him experienced would be wrong, but he was he has political instincts unlike anyone I've seen since at least Ronald Reagan. If you look back to 2004 and what was it, the Nine Dwarves, all the various Democratic nominees, you also similarly got some rather crazy non-level-headed arguments and some more level-headed arguments coming out of, for example, John Kerry.
Yeah. Okay. For the final segment here, you wrote a great post for the Gunpowder and Lead blog on coming trends in foreign policy. Can you set that up for us?
Absolutely. I mean, what I was trying to do, I wrote this, and there'll be when we post this video, there'll be a link next to the video. But what I was looking at is the major national security trends that are going to shape this decade that we're in the midst of. And we're 2 years in, and it's a good time to take stock of what are those things that are really going to affect us, particularly now that Obama is doing his major strategic review. The U.S. is pivoting from Europe towards the Pacific. So, listicles are always, at their best they can be thought-provoking. At their worst, they can be highly annoying. I think I put together one that is thought-provoking and hopefully not annoying. But maybe what I'll do is go down, add a few thoughts on what I think are the 5 major trends, see what you think about them. And then
I was actually annoyed at how thought-provoking it was, Daveed.
Okay. I have no comeback to that. So the thing that I put number 5 on the list is the U.S.'s strategic pivot towards the Pacific. And this is historic in nature. This is truly important. But I didn't think it was going to be the defining trend of this decade. because it's very much focused on traditional national security issues, state-to-state conflict. In particular, it's very clear that the U.S.'s pivot and moving bases to Australia, that all of this is designed. To contain China would be, I think, the wrong term. But to use one of those Tom Friedmanisms, that rare ones that are actually useful, it's a containment light strategy.
Yeah.
Not hard containment, but soft containment. But ultimately, my own take on China is that China is so concerned about internal fragmentation. It has a lot of instability. Over the course of 2010, you had 180,000 protests in China. Protests, riots, incidents of civil unrest. And China, one reason that they cracked down on both the Uyghurs, which is their Muslim population, the Xinjiang province, and also the Falun Gong, which is a quasi-Christian sect, is because they are so concerned. They have such a big country that's growing, but the growth is fragile, that anything that disrupts from Chinese national identity, they see as a potential threat to them. I'm not justifying their crackdowns, but I'm saying that's why they do it. And I think it's this concern about internal stability that's really going to put a check on U.S.-Chinese major conflict unless things come to a head over, basically, competition for resources. What do you think, Matt?
No, I think that's a great point. I think people talk up China's rise all the time. It's kind of become a cliche in American foreign policy, but less understood are the kind of the internal limiting factors to this rise. Things that are really beginning to come to the fore, as you said, all these protests and these minority issues within China. And I totally agree. I think that's an excellent point. That we're gonna see this evidenced more and more in the future. It'll be really interesting to see how the Chinese government adapts. They've proven, I think, very good at adapting to changes and kind of creating, a system that's competitive. It's not democracy. It's kind of it's capitalistic, and there are certain bargains that the regime, or if I can call it that, or the government, not to use a pejorative, has made with its population. And it's kept enough people satisfied to so that the protests don't get seriously out of hand. But it's moving in that direction. I mean, I'm kind of curious. At what point do you think? Do you think in the next decade we will see a crisis point, or how do you think this will play out?
You mean it internally with? That's a good question. I really don't have a good reading on that. I can't say. For one thing, though, I've had graduate school classes looking at China and East Asia more generally, and follow it fairly closely. I'm by no means an expert on China, and when you look at expert opinions, they vary wildly. In part because it's such a massive country. One great point that Antonio Giustosi makes about Afghanistan is that you don't really have many Afghanistan experts. Maybe you have a small handful, but really you have people who are experts on a certain region of Afghanistan, maybe a certain province. Knowing Kabul well doesn't mean you know Kandahar well. Yeah. Knowing the Hazara areas well doesn't mean you know the Uzbek or Tajik areas well. There are very few people who are experts on the entire country. And China is a far, far bigger country, obviously, than Afghanistan. And moreover, conducting in-depth, good field research on these critical questions, I think, is very difficult for any researcher to do. So you have very wildly varying estimates. That doesn't mean that nobody knows what's going on, but when you have estimates that vary so wildly from people who are highly educated, making definitive claims on either side, it makes me skeptical as to about epistemological issues. Do we actually know what's going on? So what I can say is that I certainly would profess that I don't know the answer as to whether this internal unrest will come to a head this decade. But what I will say is China views it probably, in my view, as their top national security concern, internal instability. And as such, when you're worried about internal instability, it puts a real check on your ability to conduct foreign adventures. Obviously, they have a very activist foreign policy, which involves securing resources, basically a mercantilist foreign policy. in places like Africa, Afghanistan as well, with the Anak copper mine in the Logar province. And what this amounts to, though, it goes back to internal issues for China. What they're trying to do is to secure the resources they'll need in order to sustain their growth.
Right.
So go ahead.
Well, yeah. Let's move on to the others as we're drawing to the end here. Let's run through some of the other trends that you think are coming.
All right. So I'll run through them quickly. The number 4 trend, speaking of protests, is technological changes that empower small groups and non-state actors. Time magazine named the protester the person of the year. We can see this particularly in the Arab Spring. The fact that you have protests which are enabled by things like social media, and certainly the Al Jazeera effect was very important to them, that were able to knock down a number of very long-standing regimes in the region. You have, to a far lesser extent, the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has gotten so much attention. I don't think that I wouldn't say that Occupy Wall Street. I'm not saying that it is a national security concern, but what it does show is the ability of organization of small group organization to really drive an agenda, and protests can be manipulated. I think, for example, when you look at the protests that rocked Britain back in August, it's very hard to say that they had a noble purpose. But the protesters, as the very good Wired story that came out in December, were both highly organized and also they were just brimming with confidence. The police found it very difficult to stop these highly networked protesters. This is the kind of thing, particularly in an era of austerity, you could see sort of a feedback loop where budget were cuts to social services, cuts to government employment. So when you look at what happened in Britain, there's a very good story in Wired in December that outlines how the rioters there were hyper-networked, very organized, very confident, very difficult for the police to stop. This is something that could create a situation where there's basically a feedback loop, where on the part of governments there are cutbacks to social services, cutbacks to employment provided by the government as we move into our age of austerity, and in return, people feel like they have much less to lose, which magnifies social unrest, which is made more powerful by technological connections, and maybe cutbacks to police make it even more difficult to deal with a situation like this. So that's why I put it as a fairly high national security concern over the course of the next decade. The third thing on my list is political dysfunction. Something that has been talked about a lot. The State of the Union address gets into the issue of political dysfunction itself. I certainly agree with those who say that's a concern. If the government it seems unable to govern, it's going to be far, far more difficult to give people confidence that it can deal with any of these major challenges that are relatively new challenges. The number 2 issue for me was natural resource scarcity. And in particular, when you look at countries that have been national security concerns over the course of the past decade, there's a lot of natural resource issues in them. For example, Pakistan is embroiled in the worst energy crisis of its history. You've had food prices massively skyrocketing in Pakistan and also other parts of the world. A lot of the Arab Spring countries have had that problem. This is something that could be very destabilizing in multiple ways, even if we don't see outright, say, resource conflicts. And the top issue for me, Matt, was the national debt, which really will constrain our ability for long-term planning and to deal with these other significant challenges.
Right, and political dysfunction in terms of the U.S. also plays into that, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think looking at I think 4 and 3, kind of technological empowerment and political dysfunction. I mean, there's a connection there too. I mean, because the former enables the expression of dissatisfaction at the latter, right? I mean, that's what we saw. Right. I mean, Time Magazine had its Person of the Year, as you mentioned, the protester. I wrote a short piece about that, how I thought it was really disrespectful of the protesters in the Arab world to kind of group them all together. I mean, I recognize, and I think it is very important to recognize what, say, the Occupy Wall Street protests had with the protests in Tahrir and the rest of the Arab awakening, and using new technologies, social media, to organize and drive expressions of dissatisfaction and questioning the legitimacy of the governing political and economic order, but to to suggest, I mean, the similarities kind of end there for me.
One thing, though, Matt, that I would say, I think one reason I think it's good to actually go more broad with the protester is because at the end of the day, a lot of people are racking up multiple Time Person of the Year awards. Right, there was the year when Times Person of the Year was you, right? That was the answer. You are the Person of the Year. Before that, it was people who use the internet were the Person of the Year, and now it's protesters. So, I mean, I think that we're a generation who can look back on their life, when all is said and done, some years later, and say, look, I was Times Person of the Year, 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, depending on what else they throw at us. That's a pretty satisfying thing.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point. And as I did note in my piece, sure, that Times Person of the Year has basically become just a hunt for page views and the creation of controversy, and there's nothing really wrong with that. But as someone who does spend a lot of time studying the Arab awakening, has been really personally moved at the bravery of these people. Yeah. I did regret a little. I thought they Time dropped the ball on this. I mean, it was not.
I mean, in seriousness, I fully agree with you. There's a fundamental difference between risking your life or your freedom and protesting to topple an authoritarian regime, and protesting in a relatively free society that provides the right to protest.
Right.
There's just a fundamental difference in terms of the amount of bravery that takes. That being said, both of them were significant news items from an American perspective. So, I mean, maybe justifiable in that regard, but I definitely agree with you about the fundamental difference in terms of what the two acts are.
No, but as for those similarities, I do think they're very important. And I think you're very correct to note that they're continuing significance. Just the use of these tools. To organize and drive expressions of, just questioning the governing systems. So I think this will bring us to the end. Thanks very much, Daveed. I really enjoyed this.
Always a pleasure, Matt. Always a pleasure. And thank you to all of our viewers.
All right, and once again to the commenters, as always, we appreciate your comments and suggestions as we continue to develop Foreign Entanglements, this new Blogging Hits program. So we'll see you next time.